right, welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Um, Before I start, I'll just say quickly that we may have folks joining us from UCLA. We were in conversation with them yesterday, last night. They said, hey, there are sweeps coming, and it's possible that we will be arrested or other things will happen. And obviously, as folks saw, there was a massive sweep last night. So I'm not totally sure whether they'll be able to make it today. Obviously, we send our uh, solidarity, of course, to people who have been a part of encampments all over the country, resistance all over the world. Um, but specifically, our thoughts are with people obviously in Gaza first and foremost, but on the encampments who are facing police violence and repression and fascist violence and repression. And so we'll talk about that a little bit today and talk about some other things. And we do have a guest who's going to join us, who has been on the ground in at UCLA as well as just he's a veteran of the LA scene, I would say, at this point, and a friend of mine. So he'll join us for sure. His name is Alejandro Villalpando. He's a professor at Cal State University, LA, which also launched its own encampment yesterday. Students launched their own encampment there yesterday. So we'll have some discussion from Alex, and we will hopefully, if it works out, we'll have folks from UCLA. And I'll say this too. Obviously, we were planning to have a conversation this morning at 10 a.m. with folks from University of Chicago, the SJP chapter there, the encampment there, and that didn't work out. They just sent me a message and said, "Hey, there's too much going on at the camp. Unfortunately, we have to withdraw." And I totally understand that. I mean, I think we've definitely, we will continue to have space open for students and for encampments and for faculty also who are facing repression to come on and talk to us. So feel free to reach out to us if that's desirable. I also understand that these things are really dynamic and there's a lot going on, and it can be hard to set a time in the future and know that you'll be able to be there because of everything that's happening on the ground. So say that up front. Um, Invite people into the conversation, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I'm going to lift up what Ari said here, which is sue the police. You have a right to protest, disclosure of investments. Police have a duty to protect you. Well, I don't know about that, but freedom of speech, unnecessary physical abuse are not tolerated. Act quickly, prepare lawsuits. I'm with that. I'm with suing the cops for sure. All right, Alex, I'm gonna bring you to the stage now. Alex, thanks for joining me this morning, man.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Jerry, for having us on, and peace and light to the young folks standing so brave at UCLA last night. Thank you. I'm sure they would have liked to be here, and maybe they will. Who knows? Things are in motion all over the city and all over the country and the world, and so yeah. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it on short notice. I know that you've been at the encampment at UCLA a few times. I know you've been following what's going on closely there. Could you just give folks some of your perspective and overview of what you've seen over the last couple of days there?
So I'll just start, from the beginning on. I would say now 2 Wednesdays ago when the USC encampment started, whatever date that was, I was down there because USC is an institution that holds I don't want to say a special place in my heart, but it holds a place in my history, right? Of being from South Central and what that university kind of symbolizes ideologically, but also materially in our community, right? Like I felt like I had to go see what was going on down there, and so I went down there just to kind of check it out. And this was, I'm sure many folks might remember, but it might feel like 30 years ago. They were de-arresting a young person, and so I was able to kind of witness this critical mass of folks surrounding, you know, um, a car which seemed like campus public safety or their police force. I don't know what they have. You know, they have their own kind of privatized and other kind of policing and security apparatus there at USC, because again, just to give people a kind of understanding who have never been to Los Angeles, USC is in the heart of South Central, historic South Central. You know, it kind of saddles in District 8 and 9 of our city council kind of cutout, right? But like, it's a big side of battle and backroom dealings, right? Because they generate so much income and stuff that can be useful for a community because they're there, right? And so there's always a battle between districts and all of this redistricting stuff with that university. And then the university produces a lot of the local leadership, governmental leadership, and nonprofit leadership, just all at all levels. You know, these two universities, USC and UCLA, really have a stranglehold on the city. And I say stranglehold, but other people may say imprint, which is fine. But they definitely have a big thing here. So what I saw was just kind of a critical mass of students in a place that has just obscene amounts of wealth and people who have attachments to what, in my estimation, seems like an obscene amount of wealth and power, regardless of their ages. And despite all of that, these students, these young folks, the community folks, right, everyone who came onto this campus was committed. But there was some kind of breakdowns, it seemed, from my perspective. I wasn't there too long because I had my young kid with me. And we, you know, it's intense. My kid is a small child, and so, but they're clearly scared not of the protesters or the young folks. I can just tell y'all from a child's perspective, it was like they weren't doing anything but chanting, and the police was getting really crazy with them. And so, and they always do that, the kid says. And so then we returned later on at about 6 p.m. that first day when they were doing the first wave of mass arrests. And I believe about 93 folks were arrested, split up into two jails. And so, again, this is not the first time, obviously, that I've seen this, but, I just want to, as we see the images, and especially if we're disconnected, but for whatever reasons, from a campus and encampment, right? And we're just seeing kind of what's being, passed off on social media or in these like, propagandistic, clips that keep, looping over and over and over, right? Um, it's very well organized and very well coordinated, and like to see the amount of people that are willing to do anything from bringing donations and supplies to doing jail support, like this is an enormous network that has been solidified over probably the last decade, right? And so there's lessons that are continue to be learned, and people are definitely moving. And so I was able to attend and support the defense of the UCLA encampment on Sunday when the Zionists fundraised nearly $70,000, is what I hear, to do a massive counter protest. And they did a kind of Coachella style, I mean, I don't have any other reference. Jared and I are part of the old man club, so we don't know what raves and electronic music are and shit. But they definitely had that shit, and it was very strange. It was a very strange thing for folks that saw. They're trying to show these images supposedly from October 7th, and they're also playing just really shitty electronic music, right? And they're dancing. And so one of the things, being on the kind of front lines inside the encampment, was seeing the faces of these folks. And you could imagine, right? Like there's kind of like a figures that I think, right? Like you may think of like IOF, veterans and, people that have fought in their forces and stuff, or maybe young people, right? Like, who have gone to their little trips or whatever, whatever that case may be. But it's not just them. Like it was, they might have had like nearing 1,500 folks. It was hard to tell because they were packed like sardines, which I think, which I thought was interesting, right? Like they felt really comfortable being packed and encircled with a bunch of like armed state forces. And you know, if the trauma from their historical past that they seem to kind of harness a lot is very genuine, and I don't doubt that that is for a lot of folks, right? Like the Holocaust trauma and all of that. It seems to me being entrapped by yourself of your own doing in a cage, almost like a cage place, would kind of trigger that, but it didn't. What it did trigger was their anger and their vitriol. I mean, these are people that were saying some of the most vile things that I've ever heard, you know. And I again, growing up the way that I grew up, right? Like there wasn't shit like that you would cross. You don't cross like certain lines. Like these fools are habitual line steppers, you know. And like I'm fucking hella tired to anyone who's watching this shit, but like this is the only way that I keep going, right? But like this is all I keep thinking. They're just habitual line steppers. And if you did that shit in a neighborhood, you know that you're escalating with certain consequences, right? Like they're basically saying the equivalent in anyone from the West Coast and maybe other areas. Like if you tag on a street of your people that you don't get along with and you say fuck your dead homies, it's kind of like that. I mean, it's just kind of like saying things like, I mean, some of them were caught on video, but a lot is not. And it's not just those chubby Zionists, you know, that are balding and shit. It's them bubbies that be at Nordstrom Rack at 10 in the morning, 11 in the morning, like yelling and yelling at these young folks to take off their masks. I mean, it was a constant, like, take off your mask, take off your mask, take off your mask. And just the most, like, childish things, you know? Like, and I'm like, y'all are grown ass people. And I don't know why that shit was, like, really kind of jarring to me, you know? Like, not a lot of shit jars me. But that was like, you an old lady, like you're an elder, like you have grandkids, like I don't know, man. It really fucking threw me off, you know, like in a lot of ways. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna talk about that a little bit later in the show. I know
okay,
because there's interesting stuff too about also like how this is funded and who's funding it, and in
right.
terms of the Zionists counter protests, which UCLA has been a big jumping off pad, and then I hear George Washington and then Columbia, they're all aiming at these campuses. But um, talk a little bit about last night because you were there as like, I mean, first of all, there was a massive outpouring of people to try to stop the raid, which I thought was really beautiful. But yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Uh I mean, I was there pretty late into the night and was able to, precisely because of those images that were going around um, on social media of the thousands of people that were down there. Because of the images that I saw the night before of Zionists coming in and beating the crap out of people, and then the state forces, the security forces, just kind of like have at it, right? Like treating these kids like pinatas and shit. Um, I was like, I don't feel comfortable staying home, so I wanted to go check it out and see, whatever. And to me, because the dispersal orders started coming in, at least as they were reported online, but also directly from folks that I knew that were down there, that they started coming in around 6 p.m. And so about there would be random dispersal orders coming out from Royce Hall over the loudspeaker. It felt like they knew that they were just kind of antagonizing and playing and kind of playing yo-yo with these young folks, right? And so every time it would just kind of escalate. But what I saw was just a deep commitment within the encampment of true solidarity from all these young folks. What I saw in the encampment was people caring for each other, people walking around with megaphones reminding everyone, we will need our energy. Please try to rest. What I saw was kids eating pizza, chicken, rice, and mushroom bowls, trying to talk, trying to smile, trying to laugh while lines and lines of multiple agencies are just outside the encampment lining up in formation to come in and ultimately hurt these kids. And they knew it. And their resolute kind of stance and their dogged determination and the dogged determination of the folks that were surrounding the encampment. This was not just like 1,000 people inside, let's say, you know, and I'm not giving accurate numbers. I couldn't give you accurate numbers. There were so many people. But when I walked up to see the stairs that everybody was seeing, I mean, it was just like, damn, it's a Wednesday. It's a Wednesday night.
Right. Right.
And that shit is in the middle of fucking nowhere. UCLA is I'm sorry, you know, I know you probably got a lot of UCLA alum, but that shit is a shithole area with no parking. I mean, it's just a fucking terrible place. And yes, people like it, but as you can tell, I'm from South Central, so I despise these locations. But I mean, it was packed. It was thousands and thousands of people ready to defend at all levels. And so while the scenes of the state beating the shit out of people is not something new, or shooting them, you know, point blank with rubber munitions and shit, you know, it's not something new, and it is something that breaks your heart. And you know, like at the end of the day, it induces so much rage. And again, I feel I don't want to be a fucking hope dealer, you know, but like it gives you a lot of fucking hope, you know. It's like I'm an old curmudgeony ass bastard, you know, and that shit, every encampment, seeing the spirit of these encampments is just and these kids are ready to win that shit. You know, there's many worlds to win, and these young folks are ready to win it. And so are the people that are aligning themselves, which I think is important, because it is true. It is not just a student movement. This is a mass movement. And the students right now are at the center, and none of them are forgetting why the fuck they're out there, you know? Like, this is all about ending collusion with a genocide, and they are very clear about that.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think the resilience is pretty remarkable, also. I mean, just given like the fascist stuff the other night, not last night, but the night before, in particular. I know it'd been going on for a couple
Mhm.
days, but like, you saw people violently assaulting protesters, hurling fireworks into the encampment, like big, like stadium style fireworks, basically.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, they weren't deterred. There was a attempt to stop the raid all night last night, and eventually the police at like 4 o'clock in the morning your time basically got in and were able to finally break it up. But they had to use weapons. They had to use grenades, flashbang grenades, rubber bullets,
Yeah.
and so I don't know. I mean, what do you think in terms of like, even when they break down these encampments, like what goes to that end? Where does that energy go?
So my assumption is that they are going to reconvene. That's it. That this is a long-term commitment. And I think what I see, so now I'm gonna get on my nerd shit, right? Like the third university is possible, right? By K. Wayne Yang, right? Like under a pseudonym, right? LaPaperson. Um, talks about not becoming an institution, right? Like a true revolutionary is never try to be like sedimented or calcified and being an institution, right? And I think these young folks know that the encampment is just like a thing. It seems like to me, again, and I'm just gleaning from the outside from these other encampments that I'm not directly intimately involved in, but just kind of witnessing and supporting. It seems like they understand that, and they are constantly negotiating, thinking about when to retreat, when to like kind of readjust and recommit, right? There is no kind of acquiescence on the horizon, it seems, from these collectives, right? And so I am concerned, I think, with like what happens in the summer, right? But this is unprecedented in this time. This is unprecedented in this time, and I think that we may think we have an understanding of what is going to happen in the summer, but things are moving very fast. And I would say keep keep faith alive and keep hope alive and keep supporting these young folks because they're still moving. I'm seeing like a lot of analysis, and I think one of the analysis is like no longer is like the aspiration to their bourgeois or petty bourgeois futures like being used as a cage to these students. And I mean, it does seem that way. Um, Jared, if you don't mind, can I talk a little bit about the Cal State LA encampment because that launched yesterday? So I just
Yeah,
wanted
yeah,
to
yeah, please, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, so Cal State LA is a working class university, right? I've spoken about that with you before, right? Like it's predominantly students of color. It mirrors CCNY's campus in many ways. We randomly just happen to have a faculty on campus from one of those other universities that mirrors us in another part of the country on our campus, and I mean they were sending us like literal like showing us messages from their students as they were getting attacked, right? And so I'll say at Cal State LA, it's clearly a student-led movement that has asked and requested faculty to stand alongside them, to support them, to defend them if necessary, but they are not, they are the leaders. So I just want to make that clear. Now, I don't know what these other encampments are doing, but it seems to be very well coordinated amongst the students that faculty are there as an ancillary and auxiliary force to support students and their demands and their goals. I don't know if that's the case everywhere, but at least for us at Cal State LA, that's what we're hearing from the students. And so their demands mirror a lot of the other demands, right? Abolish policing, disclose, divest, and end boycott Israeli institutions, right? Like so they have a clear kind of desire and they are committed. And again, these are racialized, predominantly racialized, working class, first generation college students. And, to hear kind of some of the anxieties as they were kind of, planning their actions and their things, right? To kind of witness some of that stuff and then see the anxiety also of like the other adults, right? Like our colleagues, right? Like, have they been doing the work? Do they know? And kind of at least on my end, witnessing and then kind of being there as things launch, it was enormous. It was I couldn't tell how many folks, but like for our campus, which is a commuter campus, it was over 300 people. And that's enormous.
Wow. Yeah, that's
we
huge.
had we had an event on our university campus. We had like a band come through. They had games because it's about to be graduation. We probably had more people at the encampment than they had at their university function, and this was a big university function, and it was nice. It was a nice little university function. I'm not shitting on the function, but it just shows like these students are committed. These are students that won't come to the function but are coming to these things, right? Like, and so that's just it's an amazing thing to witness as a faculty member who's had the opportunity to teach some of these students, to have them in class, to chat with them, to have office hours with them, even if they're not my students, to open a door and see them take all the stuff that they learn, that they're inspired by in different classes, like in all their studies and stuff that they see in the world and being like, let's do this. Like to see students in action creating the worlds that they've read about other people fighting for, right? Like, or they've studied or they've like admired, whether it's from Africa, Asia, Latin America, or here in the United States or anywhere else, right? Like, it is it is something so damn moving, man. Like, it's something so damn moving, and all respect to the SJP at Cal State LA. If anybody listening wants to support this working class movement, go peep them out at SJP at CSULA on Instagram. They have their list of demands. They have all the stuff that, folks can kind of plug in and tap in, especially if you're nationwide. If you're looking, if you're in an area where you're far away from an encampment and maybe, don't have connections, I can tell you these students are committed, are brilliant, are different ages, different backgrounds, and are learning so much more through this struggle about themselves, about the world, um, and about what's possible and what they've been told is impossible, right? Like they just don't care about all that, and it's that youthful energy and that brilliance that is just like, damn.
It's also it's shot up really quick because y'all didn't have a SJP chapter in October when because I interviewed for a piece I did for Prism Reports, a student on your campus that was influential in starting that up. And yeah, I mean, so this has all happened since October 7th, really, which is pretty remarkable to be able to put that together and be organizing like that in that time frame.
Yeah, it is. You named it, right? Like it is remarkable, and those young folks, they were watching this stuff, this reaction, this genocidal reaction in real time, and they're, to kind of like quote loosely some of the words, they're tired of seeing dead people every day on their phone, and that their institutions are tied to this. The institutions that are supposed to, like educate them and to some extent are extending these ideas of that they belong at the institution, and they are welcomed and they are cared for there, and that we want them to be global citizens to stand up to everything, and I think that these students are heightening the possible contradiction on their particular campus, right? Like on this particular campus at Cal State LA, to say like, you want us to do this, no? Right? Like you want this, right? Like you want us to be change agents, all the shit that used to come out on those TV programs, right? Like on those do-gooder like non-profity kind of programs. Like I remember there was a chef that was trying to like change dietary like offerings at like local schools here, and it's like we want to be change agents and all that teach for America type language and shit. Like, well, now like let's see, you really about that, so they're putting their own university, and I think all students are doing this, putting their university administrations to the test. Like, how are you going to treat them, as they're engaging in praxis, right? Because this is praxis, it's not just theoretical. And I think that that's the educational part of all of this, right? Like, if I want to like put my professor hat on, right, like my professional hat on, is that this is a lab. If science classes, STEM classes can have labs, why can't you know other disciplines and interdisciplines and anti-disciplines have labs like this also, or like cultivate labs like this in some way, shape, or form, right? Like, why can't this be considered a kind of like collective lab, right? Like, and again, I don't know that it's not being considered like that on this particular campus, right? I don't know what's going on with administration. I don't know their responses. I don't, frankly, it's none of my business. My business is to stand in solidarity with the students as they stand in solidarity with humanity, and specifically with Palestinians, to stop the genocide by the Israeli government with the support of the United States imperial forces and financial backing, right? Like, that's it. And to defend their right to do so and to defend them, and so we're there to defend them as faculty and support them, and just witness, like in a lot of ways also witness this stuff, because we got our own jobs to do. We all got a job. We all got a role to play.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you, man. I know that you probably got to go because one, you
Yep.
probably need some sleep and you got stuff to do today. But I,
Yeah.
I do appreciate it. We're gonna have Dindi Katanga is gonna hop on in a minute and talk about her
Yes, sir.
experiences at the encampment as well. And I have a couple other things to walk people through in the meantime. But thank you so much, Alex. It was great talking to you again, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah. Peace, everyone, and peace, especially to everyone who's willing to fight for it. Let's go. Let's get out there and let's support these folks wherever it goes. This is not going to stop, and this is only going to continue to grow all over this country and the world. So let's get after it.
Peace, man.
Peace.
All right. Well, thanks a lot to Alex for stopping by this morning. Again, like I said, we'll have Dindy hopefully in a few minutes. I'm going to pull up a piece and we can kind of walk through it. It alludes to something that Alex was talking about. This. So, first, I'll say a few things about this up front. I mean, one, the Daily Beast is not a journalistic outlet that I cosign in any way, right? And so we have to read this a little bit critically, in terms of what's the slant, why are they interested in this? Nonetheless, I appreciate the reporting. So Jessica Seinfeld, who is Jerry Seinfeld's wife and apparently a cookbook author, I don't know anything about that, and Bill Ackman, who's a billionaire hedge fund owner, are a couple of the people who have promoted and given to these counterinsurgent, counter-terroristic, well, they're not, there's no terrorism happening, but terroristic, I guess, is the point I would say about them. Um, Counter protests, so called, right, that are going on. So UCLA, um, so they had a GoFundMe. She gave at least 5,000. It has had over 93,000 as of Wednesday. I'm sure by them doing press for it, it actually probably got more donations. Um, but So they're encouraging people to encourage they're encouraging people to give to these GoFundMes that are then being used to fund these counter protests, right? So I just wanted to say this a little bit because I think it's important to recognize that these counter protests are not just organic phenomenon, right? They're being funded, they're being fundraised for, they're putting up these massive screens and sound systems to be able to make it. I mean, it's really kind of like CIA like tactics, but also IOF like tactics. You know, I don't know whether they funded the fireworks or just encouraged people to bring fireworks, etc. Um, anyway, I did want to share that just because I think it's important to acknowledge that um, there's a lot of wealth and power. And like, I mean, people pointed out yesterday that one of the counter protests was a neo Nazi, right? Like a well known neo Nazi, at least to folks who do anti-fascist organizing, right? And so, like, it also says something, right, that you have these Zionists like willing to fund, fascists and Nazis to come to these campuses to harass Jewish and Palestinian students, along with, of course, all the other students who are participating and supporting these encampments. Um, anyway, so I just wanted to say a little bit about that. Um, The other guy, let's see. So the Bear Jews of Truth, an Instagram page associated with the GoFundMe, shared footage Tuesday night, including masked and black-clad men with megaphones shouting "Never again" with the caption "UCLA 3 a.m." Um, so I mean, obviously, we have this is an interesting development, I think, in some respects, because I was talking to my father this morning. My father was pretty active on campuses during the 60s, and you had police. There was a little more hesitancy, and certainly it took, I think, more time. Obviously, it escalated quite a bit, which I'm going to walk through some of that a little bit later as well. But to when you get to the early 70s, then Kent State happens in 1970. So I think that's an important thing that people sometimes like pinch all this time down into a very short period of time. The Vietnam War was a 20-year long war, right? And so that I say that because I think it's difficult to draw direct comparisons between the Vietnam era and what we're seeing right now. Um, Here is, yes, this is the name of the neo-Nazi. Thanks for that. Yeah. Um, uh, Glad to hear the UCLA students are being released. Uh, yes, a cookbook author. Uh, so anyway, I just say that because there's a lot of talk about 1968, right? And there were important protests in 1968. 1968 is the year, obviously, that Lyndon Baines Johnson decides not to run for re-election. It's the year that Malcolm X is assassinated. It's the year of the summer of rebellion and revolt. It's the year of the Democratic Convention where a lot of the left got the crap kicked out of them by um, Chicago police, but there was like heavy melees there. Um, and so obviously it's a very important year, but it's not until 1970 that Kent State happens, right? So um, actually, while we're waiting for Dindy and Dindy, you can join anytime when you're able to, but I'll go ahead and walk through a little bit of that. So the book that I've been thinking about a little bit lately is Outlaws of America, the Weather Underground and the Politics of Solidarity, which is by Dan Berger. It's a very interesting book if you're interested in the Weathermen as an organization and their kind of history, Weather Underground. Um, but the piece about it that I really wanted to walk through is about a 4-page section of it in the beginning, which is where Dan Berger's addressing some of these notions of uh sorry if I said Malcolm, I definitely meant MLK in 68. Yeah. Um is addressing um the idea that there was a good 60s and a bad 60s, or the idea that there was peaceful protests in the early 60s and then things went dark in the late 60s and the early 70s, right? And this kind of or that there were these bad actors or factions that pivoted to violence, right? These are tropes that you hear by people who want to demonize people for taking, militant action. And so I'm gonna walk through few pages of this, and I'll share my screen on that. Hang on one second. All right. Okay. Try to make that as big as I can. Apologies. So first of all, there should be an E version of Dan Berger's book, and there's not. So whoever's responsible for that, probably AK Press, right? Yeah, y'all need to get on that. So these are like kind of fuzzy looking screen grabs from Google Books. But anyways, I'm going to read a little bit of this. So, the best of times, the worst of times, moving beyond the tale of 260s. The Weather Underground was not an aberration, but rather one expression of the rising revolutionary fervor of the late 1960s that saw people going underground, establishing feminist collectives, heading to the factories to organize the workers, building lesbian, gay, and transgender gender communities, and generally breaking from the US establishment. The Weather Underground was one of several clandestine groups, including those organized by Black nationalists, Puerto Rican independentistas, multiracial anti-capitalists, Catholic anti-war pacifists, clandestine abortion providers, draft resistors, and others. It was part of a quote parallel universe of burgeoning movements against what seemed to be a decaying imperialist system in its last throes. Even before people were building an underground, militancy was on the increase. A radical magazine listed 236 acts of sabotage and terrorism in the United States in 1968 alone, a figure that would rise in years to come as protests routinely turned into street fights and bombing, sabotage, and armed struggle became commonplace. So, just to say something quickly, I'm not here to advocate any form of tactic or militancy or whatever, but what I appreciate about this passage that I'm going through is it kind of talks about how did that start to happen, right? Like it doesn't just happen because people are making a choice of tactics, right? And I think we think about this as we see all these different ways that um in a moment like right now, protesters are trying to defend something that should be as simple or non-confrontational really as an encampment, right? The 60s was not the imagined neat 10-year period of nonviolent protests that ended in a quick, misguided burst of nihilistic violence. Instead, it was a dynamic period starting with the first wave of civil rights activism domestically and national liberation movements globally in the 1950s, and stretching to the anti war, feminist, working class, queer, and anti racist organizing that lasted well into the 1970s. No one tactic circumscribed the era, and political perspectives were constantly shifting in response to global events. The Weather Underground emerged from a cauldron of Black power and state repression, of national liberation and cultural shifts, of revolutionary hope and steadfast determination. In much of the history written so far, however, the Weather Underground becomes a poster child for the bad 60s, the symbol of a dream deferred, if not destroyed. Even the sympathetic histories sometimes define the first, more liberal half of the decade as the good 60s and the second, more radical half as the bad 60s. The good 60s, according to participant scholars like Todd Gitland, author of The 60s Years of Hope, Days of Rage, were characterized by youthful optimism, heavily influenced by liberal ideals. The bad 60s saw the death of a dream, an allusion to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous vision of integration, a dream that no longer defined King's politics in the late 60s. This death of the dream was marked particularly by the rise of Black power. All right, I'm going to stop there for a second because we have another guest. So, Dindy, thank you for joining me on No Notice. You were just in the chat a few minutes ago, and I saw your comment, and I thought you'd be another great person to have on to talk. So, yeah, just share a little bit of your experiences with what's going on in the city right now, and I know you've been at UCLA, so whatever you want to talk about with regard to that.
Greetings and good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity for me and us to talk about what's been going on. The mainstream media has been particularly atrocious, as expected. And so my name is Dindi Kitonga. I am an educator here in Los Angeles. I'm not a UCLA affiliate, so I'm not a student, faculty, or staff. I do have many friends and comrades across departments and work with folks there. And I'm also not part of the student movement, so I'm not here to speak on anyone else's behalf. I'm not a member of SJP or any of the student groups who've been organizing. But myself and my collective have participated in a supportive role, comes to security, logistics, and some of the general support over at UCLA. So glad that you had our good friend on before. And what I can say about UCLA in general, I'll start by saying we are completely enraged. The past couple of days have been very ridiculous. And the type of violence, first of all, starting with the Zio-fascist violence, has been something I've not witnessed before. I've been a part of movements for a long time, since the mid-90s, and I haven't seen this particular flavor of what this is. And I don't even have words for it. Really quite bizarre, absurd, and has psychological dimensions to it, which are interesting. And so I think maybe I'll start with Sunday. I know the prior guest talked about what that was. I was on the inside for that day. And what happened there is that the UCLA, a public institution, allowed this group to pull a permit, put up a giant jumbotron across from the encampment, and just have this, I guess we will call it a rally, if that's what we're going to call it, of not just Zionists, but they start with the national anthem. They played the Israeli national anthem, and then they played really the worst day wave music I ever heard ever. So they had a dance party involved in this situation. It was loud. Everyone involved, we all had earplugs in. It was a matter of protecting people's hearing. And the encampment starts on Thursday night. And every single night of this, it's been psychological torture for anyone who was in that encampment. And by psychological torture, I mean loud sounds. When I was there on Tuesday, strobing lights, this giant projection of babies screaming. And then I cannot think of the song right now, but it's a song that the IOF play. It's repetitive, annoying, and quite frankly torturous. And that was on a loop, a continuous loop. Um, and the people who descended on campus were, some of them do want the veneer of respectability. And so that rally was, when it was pushed out, it was kind of this idea of let's support Jewish students. The people on the ground who end up instigating and beating up people and whatnot are kind of all man. It's eclectic. So you do have xeo-fascists. You kind of also have our local fash who show up for everything and anything against Black movement. They show up at school board meetings. They're the local transphobe, QAnon, like just giant, whatever. And those people would stay hours on end. I did a stint on a Sunday and on Tuesday. On Tuesday, it was like 5 or 6 hours of people as you're just standing there in complete silence, yelling, not just the most out of control things that you ever heard of, but it was, I'll say, creative in the worst type of ways, calling for people to be essayed. Sorry, I don't want to use all the words.
Right.
Yelling all sorts of racial epithets at people, harassing women and femmes. A lot of what happened on Sunday would be men who would just stand in front of you and berate you for hours on end. I want to give the student movement a lot of credit for their discipline and their creativity, because part of what they wanted was to maintain the encampment and not to, and so some of the tactics that they decided to employ were those of really linking arms, not engaging. And as you see, you can never be too nonviolent. You can never, right? It doesn't matter. And so part of the reason I'm here, quite frankly, is that I'm glad that there's a space to discuss this. And our local reporting, I live in a so-called blue state. All these electeds are so-called, and maybe I'll say it, DSA endorsed candidates, progressives, what have you, have nothing to say, not a peep, not a word about it. These people are shameful and they need to be shamed. There's going to be a next phase of this and we're completely enraged. I do want to mention, not in a paternalistic way, a lot of the people involved in this encampment are very young. The people who you are seeing being ragdolled and mollywopped are 19 years old, they're 20 years old, and they're 21 years old, who have more courage than many of the people we have out here. And I don't want that to be lost.
I appreciate that a lot. Aside from all the kind of wild Zionist fascist stuff that's going on, like what has been your experience from like the students in the encampment and that space? I mean, is there anything that you want to share about um I mean, maybe it's just been having to deal with reacting to this constant deluge of crap, but like I'm just curious if you had anything to share from that as well.
Yes, I would say that the encampment, anytime when I was there, it was beautiful. And I really say this as someone who's occupied quite a few times, and also as someone who I do have thoughts and analyses around occupations and how and why we sometimes don't make it. And this is really it was very much a beautiful affair. Tons of teach-ins. Don't let anyone let a narrative go that students are unengaged or don't read or they don't understand. They understand. They understand, and I shouldn't even have to say that. A real commitment, the type of commitment in just the little bit of the insight I've seen, a real commitment to taking this to the end. And so night after night, there's been the threat of maybe this is the night where it really goes down, and the encampment won't be maintained. And people have stayed. People have stayed. They understand that their material lives are on the line. They're risking their livelihoods. You know, if you're a med student, maybe it's your license. If it's graduation, there are FJP, so Faculty for Justice for Palestine. Those folks are, you know, the administration keeps putting out threats, as I see them as threats to dissuade people, and no one was dissuaded. A real commitment to study struggle. I think I was really impressed by that, and a real commitment to study not just the Middle East or Palestine, but all forms of settler colonialism. And so part of actually how I got a little bit involved was for a call for teach-ins. They reached out to the community and they found people who were involved in all sorts of areas discussing these things, and that's what they wanted, and they remain committed to that to the very end, and great love for each other, especially night after night. After, what is it today? Sorry, it's been a long one. It's Friday.
Today is Thursday. No, it's Thursday.
So it's Thursday. Okay, so the night of the zeo-fascist of that kind of zeo-fascist invasion, you know, every night has kind of looked like this, to be quite frank. There was a night someone released, they came out and released mice into the encampment. Like, the tactics are diabolical, like really diabolical. And so it's really been beautiful to see people pivot and stretch and move themselves with their tactics. Young people who are new be like, let's go. And then people with experience show up as well, and give space for this movement. I really must give this movement a lot of credit. There were negotiations. I won't say negotiations. There was talk with administration yesterday. And part of our particular anger is what SJP told the admin is they told them, you could call the 3 agencies that showed up for this. They could call them off. And UCLA chose not to. So UCLA is going to need to own every bit of this. Our mayor is going to need to own every bit of this, as well as the governor. And yes, I live in Los Angeles, it's California. They've decided that state violence is the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting thing to sort of note, just that, like, I mean, this is not just, you know, there's all kinds of stuff going on all over. Obviously, Texas has had a particularly violent response at Austin.
Yeah.
Which is the most liberal part of Texas, I would say. But anyway, but then there's, you know, you have Columbia in New York, right? And you have this going on in LA. And so, you know, it's not, there's a lot of it's that happening in these kind of big metropolitan bases of the Democratic Party, at major, you know, elite or highly revered institutions. So, I mean, that's just an interesting dynamic. I have to say, I mean, obviously, we're going to have a conversation with Max Isle on Sunday, and I don't want to preempt what I think his argument will be. I think his argument, but I think to some extent he would say it just reveals how fundamental the connections between U.S. imperialism, Zionism, and these institutions are, that they're willing to come down so hard, so quickly. Nonetheless, I still find myself questioning it on a kind of tactical or strategic level, because I think it's just so over the top in terms of the response to college students. You know, it's not something that we've really seen on college campuses in my lifetime. You know, I was talking to my father earlier, and like, I know the anti-apartheid struggle, which I was too young to really remember very well. I know that in the 80s that was a pretty significant struggle, but I don't know that there was this much violence meted out, and certainly not this quickly after
Yes.
like it's starting up. It's not they're not even allowing these encampments to go out for a few weeks or whatever, finish out the school year. It's just like an immediate kind of response of demonization and policing and allowing fascists to hold these, you know, wild counter rallies or whatever we want to call them. I mean, they're actually attacking people. So it's like even the term rally but yeah, the psychological torture that people are being exposed to. Yeah, it's wild to watch. So yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to say, Dindy, before I let you go? I really appreciate you coming on and just sharing
Yeah.
your perspective as well.
Thank you. No, I guess the only thing I will say is, I think what's been revealed, even for people who didn't necessarily have this analysis, is the university's commitment to kind of, I think what we're witnessing is an interesting kind of neoliberal rot. And it's eating itself up. So even, you know, what is the defense of so-called liberal democracy in this moment? This is one of the questions I've been asking myself, right? So they're going to say, vote at least, vote and maintain liberal democracy. That, of course, that is better than fascism, right? And that's the question I see everyone asking. What is it for? What is the utility of a so-called liberal democracy in this particular moment? When as students understand it, as I understand it, like the fascism is already here. And so I don't know where some of these folks move on to next. I also, there's a disappointment around the intersectional identity, faculty, scholars, activists, organizers. Where are you in this moment? There's disappointment, and I think youth are finding disappointment with some of these Black and brown faces in high places who lack the moral courage to even say this is bad, this is wrong. That's a real kind of issue, I think. And I think also, part of the way this kind of neoliberal thing is working is UCLA wants to be viewed as an institution that is not brutalizing its own students. And as such, you let the xenofascist go, right? They let everybody else do, and then you're like, well, we do this in the service of other people's safety. Instead of, UCLA doesn't want to own the fact that they don't want the encampment on their campus. And that they don't want to negotiate, that they don't want to talk about divestment or any student of demands, and they're not showing up in any real way. And so they are willing to kind of let the fascist kind of element take over and violate. And it's going to be really interesting what happens next here. And then the last thing I'll say is just the way in which students are making connections. Everyone out here where I am, not U.S. imperialism, the question of abolition, the idea that there should be someone else who's going to protect us from what this is. I've been seeing a lot of people questioning and thinking about that, and then also connecting this more broadly and wider to settler colonialism across everywhere. So that encampment was also free Congo. That encampment was also free Haiti, free every colony the US has, Guam, Hawaii, and everywhere else. And I think that should be understood as students are very much developing and already have it. Like I've been the student of what's going on here, of this very whole and total philosophy and of understanding of how people want to be free. And so it's been really impressive to me that end. And yeah, thank you so much for just all my comrades are in jail, so I gotta go sort that out after this. But yes, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, I definitely want you to get to that. That's important, but I so much appreciate you stopping by, Dindy, and just sharing these reflections, which I think are spot on and really important things that you're highlighting in terms of some of the contradictions and things that students are dealing with. Also, that idea of neoliberalism kind of eating itself. I think that really names something that I'm seeing as well. So anyway, I always appreciate talking with you, and thank you for stopping by.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great
All right.
rest of the show.
All right, thanks. All right. So again, thank you to Dindy and to Alejandro for stopping by. Very much appreciate their reflections, their experiences, their contributions. I am sorry that students weren't able to make it today. But as you heard, Dindy just referenced there's a lot of folks who were, uh, locked up last night, really this morning, because I think it was about 4 a.m. this morning that they finally were able to kind of break up the encampment. But also glad to hear that a lot of the students are now getting out, so hopefully we'll be able to reschedule with, the other with U Chicago, with UCLA, with other students who want to continue to have these conversations and talk and present um, their analyses, their experiences. Um, all right, so I'm going to keep going with a little bit more of this discussion from Dan Berger's book, just because I think it's interesting to kind of, again, like contextualize the moment through which um, people took different tactics and why, right? Within US history. All right. So, um, it's in that context. Uh, so wait, let me go back for a second to what was the end of the last slide. So the end of the last slide read, the death of the dream, right? The death of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. The death of the dream was marked particularly by the rise in Black power and a more radical view of US society. In that context, the Weather Underground is seen at best as a naive distraction, at worst as a willful destruction of what was good about the 60s. But the dream did not simply die. Like scores of radicals in the 1960s and 70s, the dream was killed, mostly by the state or by those acting in its interests. Martin Luther King, who had gone from a liberal civil rights preacher to an outspoken critic of U.S. foreign policy, was murdered in 1968 while in Memphis supporting striking garbage workers. Police and FBI agents murdered dozens of Black activists, particularly from the Black Panther Party, as well as Native American, Latino, and to a much lesser extent, white radicals in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Pine Ridge, Attica, San Quentin, and elsewhere. At the same time, cities across the country rose up in rebellion after rebellion. Therein lies one of the greatest fallacies of the tale of two sixties. It obscures why people embraced radicalism and militancy. Without understanding the impact of state repression, radical movements don't make sense. The rationality and motivations underscoring the rise of groups such as the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army, as well as revolutionary above ground groups, is apparent only in the context of dozens of murdered Black radicals from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King, Bobby Hutton, to Sandra Pratt, and beyond, as well as those Latino, example Ruben Salazar, and Native American Anna Mae Aquash, radicals murdered in as the 1960s became the 1970s, and the government conducted an expanded and often secret war against all forms of dissent. In its own words, the FBI was attempting to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and or otherwise neutralize political opposition, particularly among insurgent people of color. I think that's important just even to go back to that COINTELPRO, line that he's quoting there, right? Expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize. We see all of those tactics of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism on display right now in the media, in the statements of law enforcement, in the statements of our politicians. So that's an important thing to, I think, pay close attention to. The Tale of Two Sixties also misses the other side of the turn to radicalism, the sense of possibility, the very real and logical belief that revolution was not only feasible, but likely. Dividing the decade into good and evil halves misses the continuity of resistance, as well as the magnificent accomplishments of the revolutionary movements of the period. People had a sense that their actions made a difference. Lyndon Johnson's refusal to run for re-election in 1968 showed that the ruling elite could be impacted by protests. The Vietnamese, unified against US occupation, were showing that even a militarily superior superpower could be defeated after the National Liberation Front's 1968 Tet Offensive. Many activists became convinced not only that the United States was losing, but that it should lose in Vietnam and anywhere else it tried to dominate. It was time to choose sides. I just want to pause on that for a second because this is actually, I tweeted this out the other day, but I asked my father because there was a tweet that went around last week about whether, well, it basically, no, let me get it right. It was just a person who said, the anti-war protests in the 60s were anti-war, but they weren't pro-Vietnam. And he said exactly this. He said exactly that, you know, we cheered the Tet Offensive. And he said, at a certain point, you have to choose sides. And I think that's really important, to give folks a sense. My father was in business school at Stanford at the time, right? So, like, not exactly a marginal institution or space. And he did end up dropping out. But, uh, like that gives you a sense of the type of institutions and people who were coming to those sorts of conclusions. Um, and I had said something about that, and some folks who I know, Audrey Bombsey, I think, who is a member of the National Lawyers Guild, and other folks from that generation, they said, look, we were chanting, um, and I'm going to forget the chant, but they were chanting pro Ho Chi Minh chants, right? We were chanting pro NLF chants. And I just want to underscore that, right? Because I think there's a desire by certain people to just make it anti-genocide in terms of what's going on with young people right now. And there certainly is that. But even when we had that conversation with those folks from Cornell yesterday, they were very quick to underscore that they see the resistance as just and that they are aligning their own politics with that vision of justice, right? And I think that you see, again, this is a similar dynamic, and a lot of people referred, when people don't remember this now because the narrative's been changed so much. But when October 7th happened, immediately a lot of folks compared it to the Tet Offensive, compared it to the reopening of kind of anti-colonial resistance and possibility. Um, and it's been so this is why there's been such a strong media campaign to rewrite that narrative about October 7th, to make it this thing that you have to condemn, this so-called atrocity, right? Um, and not see it as a form of legitimate resistance. Um, and so anyways, wanted to say that. All right, I'm gonna keep going with this. Get up the next page. All right, there's just about two more pages I'm gonna do, so All right. That It seemed that lines were clearly drawn between socialism and imperialism. This was, again, if folks remember the part of the sentence that preceded on the previous page, it was time to choose sides, and it seemed the lines were clearly drawn between socialism and imperialism. A former Panther and current political prisoner, Mumia Abu Jamal, put it, revolution seemed as inevitable as tomorrow's newspaper. Shout out to Mumia. I mean, the beautiful speech he gave recently for students, I believe, at CCNY in Harlem at CUNY. And obviously, he just had his 70th birthday, and he is still not free. Um, so hopefully, free Mumia, support movements to free Mumia. Young people played an especially prominent role in this burgeoning movement. SDS, just for folks who don't know, is Students for a Democratic Society. The SDS national office in Chicago summed this up with a Cuban poster that read, "Youth will make the revolution." A Fortune magazine poll in the fall of 1968 found that 368,000 university students considered themselves revolutionary. A similar poll of college students by Gallup in 1970, so 2 years later, found that 44% felt violence on behalf of social change was justified, and more than a third described themselves as left or far left. A few months after the U.S. invaded Cambodia, the New York Times reported that 4 out of 10 college students, nearly 3 million people, thought a revolution was necessary in the United States. By 1971, a Playboy survey found that 1.17 million university students considered themselves revolutionaries. Resistance was also growing in the armed forces. In May of 1970, the Wall Street Journal reported that at least 500 GIs deserted every day in May. Many of the Black anti-war soldiers were joining radical organizations like the Black Panthers when they returned, and soldiers in Vietnam began to frag their officers as part of their opposition to the war and to U.S. imperialism. In the spring of 1970, so this is 2 years after 68, following the murders of 4 students and the wounding of 9 at Kent State by the National Guard during a protest against the U.S. invasion of Cambodia, a reported Harris poll reported demonstrations on 80% of U.S. university and college campuses as more students agreed that social progress was most likely to come through radical pressures outside the system. Radicals on and off college campuses were being met with increasing violence. Within 10 days of the Kent State murders, police killed 6, wounding 20 Black people at a protest against police brutality in Augusta, Georgia. And state and local police killed 2 and wounded 12 Black students in demonstrations at Jackson State University in Mississippi. Also that month, police bayoneted 11 students at the University of New Mexico, wounded 20 people with shotgun fire at Ohio State, and wounded another 12 with birdshot in Buffalo. Student strikes and sabotage of government buildings exploded across the country. By May 10th, 1970, Max Elbaum writes, quote, "A national strike information center at Brandeis announced that 448 campuses were striking or shut down. Some 4 million students and 350,000 faculty were." Sorry for the long pause, folks. All right. We're taking part 350,000 faculty were taking part in what amounted to a campus general strike. Also during this time, 30 ROTC buildings were burned or bombed, and National Guard units were mobilized on 21 campuses in 16 states. Considering the leading role community-based struggles by people of color played, it is all the more significant that predominantly white campuses were in such open revolt, building in part off the ubiquity of Black ghetto rebellions, of which there were approximately 300 between 1964 and 1968 alone. These rebellions, along with the rising belief in self defense, work pioneered by people such as Robert Williams and advocated by many revolutionary nationalist groups in this country, were blunt arguments against what many saw as the futility of strictly pacifist revolt. All right. I'm going to stop there. Folks, I do encourage folks to read the book, check out more. So the point in saying that is a couple of things. One, to think about also how quickly some of this is happening, how quickly we're moving in our time, from one, the response, the swiftness of the response, right? The coordinated response. Um, I think in some ways this has to do with how well coordinated counterinsurgency is in the United States nowadays, right? Where in the 60s, I'm sure it was, but you had the FBI with COINTELPRO. You did have numerous other programs. CIA was running Operation Chaos. Um, there was, uh, the police red squads. There was all of the BOSS, I think in New York. There were all of these different levels of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism that were going on. But we tend to think about that. I don't think we often think about how long it was that these dynamics kind of were playing out, the time that it took to kind of move from one thing to another. Um, there's a lot going on right now, and I just think that for a lot of students, like, what does it do to you, right, when you set up your encampment and then immediately there's some hedge fund guy, Bill Ackman and Jerry Seinfeld's wife, crowdfunding and supporting fascists coming to your campus to, you know, play baby screams, bad techno music, video of October 7th, and um, and then start trying to pick fights and hurling fireworks at you. Um, you know, and then the next day you have, you know, the largest police force in the world. I don't know, the LAPD's up there. Um, you know, bring thousands and thousands of officers, even as you have thousands of people come out to try to stop the raid, um, and able to hold them off for hours heroically and I think importantly, right? I don't think even if they eventually destroy the encampment, I don't think that that's meaningless. Um, and Colin says that NYPD is the largest in the US. Okay, I'll take your word for it. They're both very large. Um, the So anyways, I just think it's fast tracked, right? In terms of like the tactics, every day you have to recalibrate your tactics. You have to think about what's working in these situations, what's not, what is your enemy willing to do. Um, and I think that the level of repression is going to have uh I don't think it's going to have the effect that the ruling class and the cops and I mean, yeah, I don't think it's gonna have the effect that the ruling class desires. I mean, I think the cops look, cops just hate the left. Cops, you know, they just relish the opportunity to beat the crap out of 19-year-olds, you know. Um, so, it's not as interesting to me what they're motivated by. But for university presidents, for your so-called democratic president that everybody, as Dindy said, everybody told you, "Vote for this guy to get rid of fascism." And a lot of that was because of the Floyd protests and how people felt like Trump was responding to those. I think you're I think you're seeing that collapse of these neoliberal institutions. And so I think that question, right, in 68, if all of those students started identifying as revolutionaries more and more every year, and as they saw that um, the uh, that empire might lose and felt that it should, right? Then this produced a different level of consciousness. Now it's a whole other conversation why that didn't work, why most of the people of this generation disavow that history, right? Most people from the 60s, are, you know, I mean, that's the Joe Biden generation, right? And they, I think, are thoroughly inculcated into the sort of propaganda apparatus and psychological warfare of the state at this point. Not all of them. I know that there's many people who listen to this show. Even I was surprised looking at our demographics recently about how many people watch this show that are 65 and older. So shout out to all of them. But as a generation, I think it's very interesting to kind of look at, study, try to understand why um, things shifted so much from, how you could go from have revolution become more and more popular and have people joining organizations and doing stuff, and then have that just be by the end of the 1970s or even the mid 70s. Maybe it's the end of the Vietnam War that does it, right? And I think that's one thing that we have to think about in this moment too, is how much of this current movement is going to be contingent upon something like a ceasefire, right? If that happens, or um, how much of it is. Somebody said something interesting in a study group the other day about how they feel like some of what's going on right now is that kids don't like being told what to do, right? They don't like being told you can't talk about this or you can't support this or this, and they can see through the kind of hypocrisy of it in terms of, and I shouldn't say kids, young people. Um, they could see through the hypocrisy of being told that this is anti-Semitic, right? Or that they support terrorism, right? They're smarter than that. Um, but also that, you tell a bunch of kids that they can't do something. This is why I think a lot of people have there's been a rebellion against certain forms of identitarian politics too. Dindy pointed that out. I thought that was really interesting, that comment about people asking where are these professors and faculty, right, who have made names for themselves off of, you know, the she used the term intersectionality. We could talk about that. We could talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Um, you know, they are unfortunately a part of the counterinsurgent apparatus within these universities and seem more loyal to that at this point than they are to an actual liberation movement or the even protecting the speech and commentary of their students. And that's not everybody, of course, but I think that reflection is a concern that I'm hearing as well from a lot of people. So, I can't make predictions. I don't know what this will produce. I don't know what this means. I don't know what happens this summer. I don't think that the energy of this is just going to dissipate, but I do I do hope that it becomes more long and sustainable energy, which I think requires people to join organizations. I think requires people to get really involved in a variety of different movements, um, in revolutionary political education. But I think it's really a positive sign. Everything I'm hearing about um, the the kind of political education that students are seeking out, that they're involved in, that they're politicizing together in these spaces, that they're confronting the limits and the latent fascism really of these neoliberal institutions, right? That I mean, I really can't imagine going to a college and starting an encampment and having my president say that we were, terrorist sympathizers, and that there were outside agitators coming in and that they needed to send in um, the police, or they needed to permit some fascist counter protest to what I was doing. I mean, that's quite an experience to go through. So I'm gonna pretty much leave it there. I just want to thank all of the students for everything they're doing. I want to thank Dindy and Alejandro for coming through on no notice. Both of them. I really just reached out to Alex this morning and said, "Hey, I don't know if they're gonna be able to make it. Can you come through for a few minutes?" And he did. And Dindy was in the chat and texted her. And so, thanks to both of them for doing that. And yeah, solidarity to all the students. And of course, let's keep our. I want to say one more thing. So there is this thing that I keep seeing float around a little bit of like, this is distracting from Palestine, or it's distracting from Gaza as they're bombing Rafah, as they're, they bombed another university, which I didn't even know there were any universities left yesterday, but they did bomb one. Actually, maybe that was this morning. Um, and I think that I understand why people feel that way, but I also think this is the movement that we have in the United States currently. And so, you know, work with it or don't, but it is what is available to you. And it's going to have its contradictions. It's going to have a lot of people who are learning a lot of things very quickly. Um, and so it's going to have its limitations. It's going to be frustrating at times, but it is something that is tangible, which I don't think we've had something like this um, in quite a while. Um, in terms of movement, I mean, probably the summer of the Floyd rebellions is like the closest in recent memory. It's different for a lot of reasons, but just in terms of a kind of mass movement that a lot of people are participating in around the country. Um, so that's that. But the other point I want to say is that us paying attention to genocide does not stop genocide from happening, right? And we live in an attention economy where everybody, including this platform, right, is seeking out your attention and trying to hold it. And we don't do it very well here. But the us being on Twitter all day, doom scrolling as we see hospitals and children and everything else that's horrible that's happening, that's not doing anything to, so I say that to say we could center Palestine as much as we want, and we should. Um, but just us paying attention and being aware of what is going on is not going to produce the change. It has to be movements, right? Um, it has to be, hopefully organization. I think it's very important that these groups think very clearly about avoiding co-optation. We've seen a couple of the encampments agree to demands. The Brown one in particular, I'll say it. I'm sorry if anybody's at Brown, but like what they agreed to in terms of I think Northwestern's the other one. What they agreed to in terms of like a potential vote in October about divestment. What's the point in even accepting that, I mean, that's, I don't understand it. So, I don't mean to second guess people, but I think that that's celebrating that as a victory is pretty shallow right now. But nonetheless, I solidarity to everybody who's trying to get what they can, and understanding that it is coming to the end of the school year in these places. And um, you know, I hope that it is not necessary in October, but you know, from a movement perspective, I hope that people continue their militancy and to continue to develop politically, get involved in organizations, um, beyond that, right? And don't let one way or another. I mean, obviously, we all want the genocide to end. We also want Palestine to be free, and that's going to be a longer struggle either way. And so I hope people stay attached to that demand and understand it as connected to their own liberation and the liberation of all oppressed people, and continue to generalize that struggle out beyond just what's going on in this particular moment. So I'll leave it there. I appreciate you all. Thank you for listening to me ramble and for listening to our guests, and solidarity to the students and to the Palestinian resistance.